Teddington Lock is a familiar name for us boat bums of the Tideway. It's there that our domain ends. The Port of London Authority yields sway to the Thames River Conservancy. If we want to proceed upstream, our little tubs have to conform to new rules and regulations. No marine toilets, dishwashing outflows sealed, gauze over the petrol vents, oil trays under our engines. Quite enough fiddle-faddle to ensure that we're more likely to head down for Sheerness and Ramsgate on a fine summer weekend than to think of going upstream to Runnymede and Henley. Of course, you can use a lock to dam a river, and if you do that, you can dry the bed out. Dry it out even more than the tidal Thames normally dries out. Up between Teddington and Richmond, where the tidal stretch of the Thames is petering out, you don't usually get the desolate expanses of mud that Greenwich and Wapping live with at low tide in any case. So it must have been curious, that day in 1953, when the police asked for the river to be dried out between Teddington and the Richmond half-lock, and officers foraged through the exposed mud, picking up spanners and ring bolts and all the bits and pieces of ironware that drop off vessels or get dumped into the river, all the time searching for a heavy knife. Ah, those innocent 1950s, when we teenagers would go out on our bicycles in the evenings and circle round and round traffic-free spaces, tossing conversation over our shoulders, or cycle off to see a friend a mile or two away, or go to a dance at the drill hall. Barbara Songhurst was 16. Christine Reed was 18. They lived in Teddington. They rode their bikes over the towpath on the weekends, sometimes giving themselves a clear summer day out riding. They went out all day on Sunday, May the 31st. They bicycled over to the towpath, returning several times during the day to chat to some boys camping there. Chat, too. You didn't chat up in those days. John Allen Wells, a 21-year-old architectural worker, had known Christine for 5 years and Barbara for 5 weeks. He said that on their last visit to the camp, they arrived at 8 p.m. and they left at about 11. Another man had seen them on their bikes near the towpath at 11:30. A bit late to be out at their age in those days, but they were good, reliable girls, and their parents had no anticipation of their getting themselves into any trouble, as indeed they didn't by any culpable action of their own. The following day, Barbara Songhurst's body was found in the Thames, about 2 miles downstream. Her cheek had been crushed by a heavy blow. Her skull had been fractured. There were 3 deep stab wounds in her back. She had been raped. Prior to the assault, she had been a virgin. Pathologists said the crime was committed by an expert rapist. I don't know what that means, but frankly, I think it sounds horrible. The police were frantically busy with the preparations for the coronation on Tuesday, which would engage almost all the Met in crowd control. But the investigation at Teddington began. The crime had taken place near the lock. There was a patch of trampled grass, some blood-stained daisies. There was a trail of blood over the towpath, where the murderer had taken his victim's body to throw her into the water. There were 2 pairs of abandoned shoes and socks, too. Something had happened to Christine. She hadn't come home either. But on Coronation Day, her bicycle was found. The silver and blue sports model was lying in the river mud, just 100 yards upstream of the murder site. Her body wasn't recovered till Saturday. Then holidaymakers saw it floating among the reeds off Glover's Island, about a mile from Richmond Bridge. Her skull was fractured. There were 6 stab wounds in her chest. She had been raped, skillfully. The pathologist was appalled by what he saw. "This is the work of a maniac," he said. "This murderer is a monster, as strong as an ape." And so the police drained the Thames, by shutting the half-locked gates at Richmond against the incoming tide. They found lots of fascinating things, but no murder weapon, and no trace of Barbara's bicycle. That's still never been found. It probably got caught in an unusually strong rush of current, and has been swept down to the deeper, faster ends of the tideway, away to East London or beyond. Duncan Webb was the brilliant crime reporter on the News of the World in those days. He happened to have been in Teddington on the night the murder happened, and was fascinated to realize that, for once, he had become one of the men who had to be considered as a potential suspect. For in rape murders of this kind, absolutely any man in the vicinity might be responsible. It led Webb to think very carefully indeed about the mystery, and he came to two conclusions, which he shared with the police. Now, like them, he assumed that both crimes were the work of the same man. Except for Barbara's smashed cheekbone, the injuries were similar, so you could immediately put it down to one man's M.O., modus operandi, method of operating. More than that, it surpassed belief that two separate men should have come down and just happened to separately rape and murder two girls in much the same place, when those two girls had spent the day together. And neither body showed the sorts of bruising and injury which would result from a pair of rapists or a gangbang. But if one man on his own killed them, how did he manage it, without the second victim screaming and running for help while he assaulted the first? Webb thought about the knife wounds. Knives. And he wondered whether the murderer had actually thrown his knife to bring down the second victim while he struck down her friend. Might this, for example, explain the wounds in Barbara's back, contrasting with those in Christine's chest? Webb put his idea to Chief Superintendent Rudkin, who didn't send him away disregarded. He liked the idea, and he had inquiries made at circuses and variety theatres to see whether any knife-throwing entertainer had been in Teddington that night. The inquiries drew a blank. Superintendent Hannam was more dismissive of Webb's other suggestion, though it was just as sound. Webb calculated that a murderer operating between 11:30 and midnight from the towpath area had to be a local man. Even someone who knew his way around the district a bit, like Webb himself, would have had a little problem in getting back to the bus stops and railway station. And once on public transport, how could the ape-man have escaped showing bloodstains to fellow travellers after he'd crushed one girl's cheekbone, smashed two skulls, and raped two virgins? And if he'd come by car, he'd have had to park it somewhere, where it would have been noticed. The motor car wasn't even a serious nuisance in 1953, far from being the monstrous and ubiquitous pest it is today, destroying the last vestiges of beauty and tranquility and decent air in what was once our lovely country full of peaceful towns and dignified cities. So in 1953, you really noticed if a car was parked in a quiet spot at night. Why didn't the police thank Webb for this suggestion? Why did Superintendent Hannon growl at him, "What we want is facts, not theories"? Oh, because it was a little too obvious and a little unnecessary. In almost any murder, the police will make inquiries in the immediate neighbourhood. In an anonymous sex murder, they will make blanket inquiries throughout a locale. They've been known to fingerprint every adult male in a town. So the police were already concentrating their inquiries in Teddington. They had taken 1,650 statements from resident males. They had checked all the nearby service bases. They had followed up men staying in hotels and guest houses and bed and breakfasts. Nothing, nothing, nothing. Nor did Webb's own hopeful investigations achieve anything. Going to pubs and cafes and churches in Teddington gave him, no doubt, some insight into the life of the southwestern suburbs, but it didn't turn up anybody with blood on his collar or a guilty twitch. Amazing, really, that anyone with Webb's experience should have thought it would. I doubt whether his life could have been so unlike yours and mine that going hopefully into a pub in an interesting area hadn't repeatedly proved itself fruitless. You don't usually find the sort of people you want that way when you're looking for them. You find other sorts of people you hadn't anticipated, equally interesting, but for filing away in the mind. So Webb drew a blank, and the police drew a blank, and the Teddington towpath murders looked likely to go unsolved. They weren't the only sex crimes in the district. A 14-year-old girl had been raped in Oxshott, about 8 miles away, just a week before Christine and Barbara were killed. A man was terrifying women and girls in open spaces on the Surrey side of the river, opposite Teddington. And on June the 17th, a woman called Mrs. Birch was attacked in Richmond Park, and a police patrol car picked up a man found walking aimlessly in Weybridge. He was taken to the police station, where he gave a good account of himself and was released with an apology. On June the 18th, P.C. Kosh was cleaning patrol cars in Kingston Police Station. Under the front seat of one, he found a chopper. He put it in his locker before he went home, and then had the misfortune to be taken ill. He was off work for 5 days, and on his return to the station found nobody had inquired for or removed the chopper. P.C. Kosh took it home and used it for chopping kindling wood. On June the 28th, a passing motorist stopped for a hitchhiker. Something about the man made him hesitate. Something clicked in his mind. The hitchhiker fitted the description of the man wanted in connection with the Oxshott rape. The motorist went to the police. The hitchhiker was picked up and charged with the Oxshott rape. Then he was put into an identity parade before Mrs. Birch, who immediately identified him as the man who had attacked her in Richmond Park. And he was the very man who had been picked up that night in Weybridge and released again because he gave such a good account of himself. His name was Alfred Whiteway. He was 22 years old. He had a criminal record, but it was for theft. He had never been associated with violence or sexual offences. What's more, he had been strongly associated with Barbara Songhurst's family. Barbara's sister-in-law, June, had once been his girlfriend. June's sister, Josephine Knight, who had been at school with him, had also hoped she might marry him one day. Barbara's brother Danny knew him well. As an older male acquaintance of the murdered girl, the police had inevitably investigated Whiteway quite carefully. Barbara's brother and in-laws had been absolutely positive Alf Whiteway would never have injured her. He was a kind man, June insisted. Kind and considerate. He used to carry a knife, but he's not the sort of boy who would do a thing like that. Why, he's a decent boy. Much too fine a chap to do a thing like that. She and her sister were most impressed that he had always behaved like a perfect gentleman all the time they'd known him. Oh, it was a great thing to be a good-looking young man in the 1950s, as long as you never made a pass at the girl next door. Danny agreed with his wife. "There's no need to bother about Alfie," he said. "He's the last person to suspect in a case like this." But he owned a knife. More than that, he had, in adolescence, become obsessed with knife-throwing. He could split a matchbox 30 yards away with his knife. He could throw a chopper into a chalk line on a tree 40 yards away. All this was known to the Knight sisters. But, like Barbara's brother, they remained positive. It couldn't be Alf Whiteway. He's not like that. Alf had come unscathed through his original interviews on the towpath murders because he presented an alibi. He had been with his wife on the night of May the 31st. They had one child and another coming, but they lived apart because they couldn't afford a house of their own yet. So he'd gone over to Kingston to visit her. He hadn't left till 11:30. His wife's confirmation of this story, taken with the Songhurst's certainty that he couldn't be involved, had left him in the clear. But now he was exposed as a violent sexual offender. And he was an expert knife thrower. And one more thing. He was very strong. That hand axe he threw at trees, where was it? He'd been asked about it before, and said it was in a cupboard at his home. The police had searched without finding it. Now Superintendent Hannam asked about it again. And amazingly, Whiteway told him that Kingston police had it, that he had pushed it under the seat of the car when he was picked up at Weybridge. Aha! So Whiteway went out at night on raping expeditions, armed with an axe, with the sort of weapon that would fracture skulls and crack cheekbones. Like a shot, Hannam drove to Kingston, only to find that the unlucky P.C. Kosh had destroyed any hope of the axe yielding valuable information to forensics. It was covered with Kosh's fingerprints. Its blade was blunted with household use. It was only likely to reveal sawdust and wood chippings. Yet it did help to solve the crime. When Hannam put it on the table before Whiteway, the young man recognized it, even protesting that it had been bashed about and blunted. Then, when Whiteway told him that bloodstains had been found on a pair of his shoes, Whiteway cracked. Confronted with his own weapon, and the news that there was some evidence that the forensic labs might turn against him, he suddenly said, "You know bloody well it was me." And then out it all came. "It's all up," he said. "You know bloody well I done it. That shoe's effed me. What a bloody mess. I'm mental. I must have a effing woman. I can't stop myself. I'm not a effing murderer. I only see one girl. She come round the tree where I stood, and I bashed her, and she was down like a log. Then the other screamed. Down by the lock. Never saw her till then, I didn't. I nipped over and shut her up. Two of them, and then I tumbled. The other one knew me. If it hadn't been for that, it wouldn't have happened. Put that effing chopper away. It haunts you. What more do they want to know? Why don't the doctors do something? It will be mental, won't it? It must be. I can't stop it. Give us it. I'll sign it." It wasn't mental. Alfred Whiteway might have felt a compulsion to rape, but nobody is mentally compelled to kill a girl because she might identify one as a vicious rapist. He was hanged on December the 23rd, 1953.